When we talk about the Battle of the Somme, the conversation almost always begins and ends with the first day. 57,000 British casualties, 20,000 dead. It's a number so vast it becomes an abstraction, a historical milestone for futility. The accepted narrative is simple, unimaginative generals clinging to old tactics, sent waves of men into walking-pace slaughter against machine guns. And that story is true as far as it goes, but it's incomplete. It's a conclusion that prevents us from asking the more critical question, not just how the British Army failed so catastrophically, but why its command structure was incapable of doing anything else. The real story of the Somme is not a story of simple stupidity versus courage. It is a story of a fundamental misunderstanding of the battlefield, a rigidity coded into the plan from the start, and the surprising adaptive response of an enemy we often forget was also thinking, learning, and reacting in real time. To understand the mistakes of the Somme, you have to stop looking at the British wire and start looking at the German dugouts, and at the broken chain of command inside the British headquarters itself. The standard assessment is that the British underestimated the German defences. That is true, but it lacks specificity. The critical failure was not a failure to count bunkers. It was a failure to understand geology and German engineering philosophy. The British intelligence was good enough to map the German trench lines. What they could not see, and what they failed to imagine, was what lay beneath them. For the 7 days leading up to the 1st of July, the British artillery pounded the German forward trenches with 1.5 million shells. The logic was sound: obliterate the wire, destroy the defensive positions, and kill the garrison. The infantry would then walk over and occupy the remains. But this assumption was based on the British model of defence, where the majority of troops were kept in the forward firing line, vulnerable to bombardment. The Germans, however, had learned from the battles of 1915. They did not defend the front line. They defended in depth. The German dugouts were not simple cellars. They were subterranean fortresses, some dug as deep as 40 feet into the chalky soil. Accessed by staircases, they were often kitted out with electric lighting, generators, furniture, and bunk beds. When the British bombardment began, the German garrison simply packed up, walked downstairs, and waited. They were safe. For 7 days, they sat in relative comfort while the earth shook above them. The British artillery, for all its noise and fury, was killing very few of the men it needed to kill. When the barrage lifted on the morning of July 1st, the German machine gunners didn't have to rush from the rear. They simply climbed the stairs, set up their weapons on the lip of the untouched craters, and faced a no-man's land filled with British infantry walking in ordered lines. The British didn't just fail to cut the wire. They failed to realize the enemy garrison was not only intact, but waiting for them. But intelligence failures are common in war. The deeper, more troubling mistake was that even if British commanders on the ground had realized the Germans were emerging from the dugouts, they were powerless to stop it. This was a result of a decision made over a year before the battle even began. A decision rooted not in tactics, but in personal loyalty and the unwritten codes of the British officer class. In March 1915, at the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, General Henry Rawlinson made a critical error. He committed his reserves too early, squandering the ability to exploit a potential breakthrough. When the operation failed, Rawlinson attempted to blame a subordinate. The subordinate protested, and the subsequent investigation forced Rawlinson to admit his fault. He was nearly sacked. He was saved only by the intervention of his superior, Douglas Haig, who protected him from the fallout. This act of patronage created a debt. When Haig and Rawlinson found themselves planning the Somme together in 1916, Rawlinson was, in the words of one historian, effectively neutered. Rawlinson, commanding the Fourth Army, favoured a cautious bite-and-hold approach, seize the first German line, consolidate, and let the German counterattacks break themselves against fresh British artillery. Haig, the commander-in-chief, wanted a grand breakthrough, a cavalry charge that would roll up the German line. He insisted on attacking the German second line on the first day. Rawlinson knew the risks. He knew that to hit the second line, the artillery barrage would have to be spread thinner, weakening its effect on the critical frontline defenses. But he could not oppose Hay. The unwritten rule was absolute. If a brother officer saves your career, you do not betray him. So Rawlinson acquiesced to a plan he likely knew was flawed. The result was a diluted bombardment that failed to suppress either line effectively. The command structure, rigid and bound by personal obligation, was incapable of adapting to the reality of the ground. There was no mechanism for a corps commander on the spot to call back artillery fire without permission from the top. It simply wasn't allowed. The British Army went into battle with its hands tied behind its back, not just by its doctrine, but by its code of honor. And yet, while we focus on the British failure, we often ignore what the Germans were doing right. The Battle of the Somme was not just a one-sided slaughter, it was a crucible for the German army. It is here, in the autumn of 1916, that we see one of the most underappreciated aspects of military history: horizontal innovation. The German army was taking a beating. By the end of the battle, over 90 German divisions, that's about 3/4 of their entire force on the Western Front, would be rotated through the Somme meat grinder. Divisions were lucky to last 2 weeks in the line before being shattered. But as they were pulled out to rest in quieter sectors, they took their experience with them. And they shared it. The Germans had a system called Erfahrungsberichte, lessons, reports. These were not top-down directives from the high command, nor were they simply bottom-up suggestions. They were horizontal exchanges. A division that had learned a new way to defend against a British creeping barrage, or, say, a better method for positioning machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire, would write up its findings and distribute them directly to other units. The demand for this information was immense. Units preparing to go into the Somme wanted to know, in specific detail, what they were about to face and what worked. The German High Command initially tried to control this information flow, but the sheer pressure of the battle overwhelmed their bureaucracy. The learning cycle sped up because the men on the ground took control of it. By the time Hindenburg and Ludendorff took over later in 1916, they recognized the power of what had happened. They didn't just approve of the Erfahrungsberichte, they made them mandatory. The German army had, in the middle of the bloodiest battle of the century, built a self-teaching organization. They developed the defensive doctrine of depth, of immediate counterattack, of flexible strong points, not because a genius in Berlin designed it, but because a system existed for frontline soldiers to teach each other how to survive. So what are the lessons of the Somme, the ones that matter for a student of conflict and survival? The first is a warning against technological arrogance. The British believed the sheer volume of steel would solve the problem, but they failed to understand the problem itself. They bombarded trenches, not the men inside them. You must understand the system you are trying to destroy, not just its surface appearance. The second is a lesson in the lethal danger of rigid hierarchy. When command is based on personal loyalty rather than professional competence, and when subordinates cannot speak truth to power, the plan becomes a straitjacket. The men on the ground, the ones who can see the uncut wire and the emerging Germans, must have the agency to react. The third lesson comes from the Germans: the power of distributed learning. In a survival situation or a tactical problem, the solution rarely comes from the top. It comes from the collective, shared experience of those doing the fighting. The side that can learn, document, and transmit knowledge faster than the enemy will win, even when losing. The Battle of the Somme is not just a story of mud and blood. It is a case study in how armies, and by extension people, succeed or fail when faced with an impossible problem. The British failed because they could not learn. The Germans survived because they could. And that distinction is one worth remembering. If you value in-depth historical analysis that looks beyond the common narratives, make sure you subscribe to War Machina. Hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who wants to understand the real lessons of history, of